According to the argument from Hiddenness, there is an observation that proves there is no perfect being, because we can deduce this conclusion from the observation given by premise K. There are some non-resistant non-theists. These are people like me, who no longer believe, or maybe never have ever believed, there is a perfect being. And this lack of belief is not the result of emotional or behavioral opposition towards God. God's perfect love implies he would always be open to a relationship, such that every finite person believes God exists, unless they are somehow resisting such a belief, because a belief that God exists is a necessary condition for a meaningful relationship. It cannot be the case that we are in a relationship with someone unless we also believe that they exist. Therefore, premise J follows. Perfect being theism implies there are no non-resistant non-theists. Consequently, conclusion L follows. There is no perfect being.
Okay.
All
I don't
right,
know if
yeah.
or Tim wants to take it. Yeah.
So, there are a few. Well, I was hoping to get to. I have a lot more to say on the probable, but at least with hiddenness, there is this sort of hidden assumption about God's nature in general here, right? Um, so what does this mean? Well, it means that humans have to have, like, every single human has to have this like dogmastic belief in God, right? Like he has to have like this belief not only that God exists, that God exists and that he has this particular nature, right? But I really doubt this conclusion, just because if we think of theism in terms of like God's goodness, right? Then in some sense we could say, again, this is just one response, right? I don't want to like present like the full rebuttal to, our full like rebuttal to divine hiddenness, because that wouldn't be fair to Ben. But the general point here is that because of God's goodness, then under theism, then if God is the good, then every state of affairs, or every good state of affairs that happens, would itself be, God's presence basically in someone's life, even if they don't necessarily like have this dogmatic belief that God exists, right? But I think most people, even Ben, would agree that there is at least, like, I think everybody, at least most people, I mean, I haven't met anyone that hasn't, but most people have this dogmatic belief that there's goodness, right? Even if goodness is not, even if they don't like know the nature of what goodness is, they at least have like this dogmatic belief that, okay, yeah, there is some goodness in my life, right? And I think this would, because the thing with the hiddenness argument, right, is that it sort of assumes that God, like there's this moral obligation for God to, or at least God is not morally obligated to make his existence not obvious to everybody, right? But I would seriously doubt that conclusion, just because of the fact that God, I would say that God is only morally obligated to make his goodness known, even if the person doesn't know that it's God that's given them the goodness in his life, right? So that's the first sort of response I would give, right? At least because there are two different aspects to the hiddenness argument. There's the moral aspect, and then there's the epistemic aspect, right? So at least with the moral aspect, when it comes to like whether or not God is morally obligated to, or God is morally obligated to like make his existence known to everybody, right? I think that could be doubted, just because of the fact that people can have experience of goodness in their life, even if they don't necessarily like have this dogmatic belief about the nature of goodness itself, right? And so then, from that point, I mean, logically speaking, everyone already experiences God, right, in some capacity, even if they don't like have this dogmatic belief that God exists, right? And I guess another point, which I don't want to spoil too much, because I will say a lot more about this when it comes to evil, but there's nothing that really requires God to fully reveal himself at this moment in our development, given the defeat condition, which, again, I'll get more into the defeat condition later, but the defeat condition, I think, would also sort of undermine at least the moral version of the hiddenness argument. And then as far as the epistemic version of the hiddenness argument, right, I think that falls into a lot of problems in regards to, like, subjectivity, right? Which means that, if an atheist comes and says, if you present, like, let's say you present a case for God, right? He has to say, like, oh, well, I'm gonna give you, a book of Swinburne, and you're like, oh, I'm just not convinced, right? It's like, well, okay, that's fine, but that's a completely subjective opinion. That's not an argument against, the cumulative case for theism, right? in that case, right? And so this leads to an interesting conclusion, which is the conclusion I came to in regards to hiddenness, is that I think that hiddenness is evidence against theism, but it's epiphenomenal, meaning that it doesn't work in the overall like status regarding, or the epistemic status regarding belief in God. And the reason why is because it's totally subjective, which means it is completely based upon how someone can be convinced or not that God exists, right? And once we get to like whether or not, once we get to that point where it's like, oh, well, I'm just not convinced, right? Well, I mean, that's totally subjective. That's epiphenomenal. That doesn't like, that's not evidence that God doesn't exist, right? Just because you're not convinced that God exists, that doesn't mean that it actually is evidence that God doesn't exist, right? Now, is there any questions in regards to that? Because I know I talked a lot about epiphenomenal evidence, and epiphenomenal evidence is just basically evidence. Like, let's say, like Zach, I have testimony that you exist, Zach, right? But my testimony is not. It's not more evidence from your perspective. It's not more evidence that you exist. It's not going to, like, my testimony that you exist is not going to change the epistemic status or your epistemic status that you exist, right? So it's the same sort of thing with hiddenness, where it's like, if they say, well, I'm just not convinced that God exists, okay, that's fine, but that's not like that's not evidence that God doesn't exist, right? That's epiphenomenal evidence, or it's evidence that doesn't really have any weight, right? So that would be my response, at least to the epistemic part of divine hiddenness, right? And that's the only thing I would overall say in response to this argument. That one, it assumes that everyone has had like this doxastic belief that God exists, which the theist doesn't really have to accept. Number two, it ignores the fact that the goodness in people's lives can itself be God's presence in their life, even if they don't like have this exact like doxastic belief. The third one is the defeat condition, which I'll get more into later. And of course, the final one is the epiphenomenal thing I just mentioned. So those are my four, I guess, general responses to hiddenness. I don't know if Tim has anything more to say on this.
I think I'll let you speak in a sec, Tim. But I do think like this is good. Like we don't want to go too in depth because like this is only like a 45-second part of Ben's opening. And like you can make a 3-hour video, which is like But yeah, I'll turn to you, Tim.
I think that so what's interesting about Schellenberg is that he actually thinks that that it is unjustifiable on theism that that God would remain hidden at any time in a person's life. So Kyle, you brought up how, well, just because it's the diachronic problem that Ted Poston and Trent Doherty bring up, which is that, well, he may be hidden at this time t, but he's not going to be hidden at this time t over here. And Schellenberg still thinks it's unjustifiable. He's like, no, at all times that any person postures themselves to wanting to have a relationship with God or know that God exists, God should reveal himself. So Schellenberg actually holds a very strong view, which is really interesting. And I think it's controversial. I don't think the theist really has to accept that. And then I think that on the point where you brought up the doxastic thing, that's the difference between the de re belief and the de dicto belief. And that you're saying that, goodness, actually being aware of goodness is actually in a way having de re belief of God's presence, right? So that's all I wanted to add there.